A conversation about Cal Newport, productive pastor 99.5. Welcome back to Productive Pastor, the place where we talk about healthy ministry through strategic productivity. I'm Chad Brooks, the host. You might be asking a lot of questions here. Chad, episode 99.5, what's that about? Then a conversation about Cal Newport. What is that about? Well, this episode's different. I've got my friend Colin Bagby. He's a pastor in Houston. Me and Colin have kind of floated some of the same circles for a long time. And over in the Productive Pastor community the last couple of weeks, Cal Newport came up. And I'm a huge Cal Newport fan. I love Cal Newport. He's kind of one of the productivity, I don't want to say gurus, let's say Obi-Wans that's out there that I just pay attention to. And I just recently finished one of his older books. And I realized that, A, I've been wanting to just talk to Colin for a while. And then B, I get to talk to somebody else who nerds out about Cal Newport. So let's make this happen. So I'm going to play a conversation that I had with Colin as we both mutually fanboy about Cal Newport and talk about what we've learned from him and why he's also really helpful for ministry leaders. Also, episode 99.5. I want to do a Q&A for episode 100, and I'm getting some good stuff in, but I want more. And so this is what I want you to do. Either come on to Productive Pastor Community or hit me up on Twitter at RevChadBrooks or just email me, revchadbrooks@gmail.com. If there's something you want to hear about on this 100th episode, I want another week to get some cooler questions. I've got good ones in, but I want more. I just think it'd be a lot more fun to have more questions. So that's what's going on. Now, sit back. I'm about to talk with Colin about Cal. Maybe one day Cal will be willing to come on the show. That would be like the ultimate apex conversation on Productive Pastor. But just sit back and enjoy us. Check the show notes at revchadbrooks.com/ let's call this PPP/Cal Newport. Let's just go straight into the conversation. So one of the things I love about the internet and ministry together is that we get a chance to connect with folks that are serving in different contexts than us. And like I said earlier, this episode, talking with Colin Bagby at St. Luke's, who pastors the Branches congregation. We're going to just geek out about Cal Newport, our favorite person for a while. But I want you to get to know Colin, and we're going to talk about productivity a little bit, but then jump into the nerd conversation about why we both are huge fans of Cal Newport. So, Colin, welcome to Productive Pastor.
Thanks, Chad. Long-time listener, first-time guest. I've been listening to the podcast, I think, since the very beginning. So I'm stoked to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. So were you listening to like the old school Productive Pastor, back in the day?
I still go back and listen to the original theme music, and I'm like, then it'll start playing, and I'm like, where's Chad?
Yeah, yeah. I was driving today to go to the pharmacy or something, and I just had a random playlist going on Spotify, and it threw out the Meter Sissy Strut, which was the original Productive Pastor theme music until I got a cease and desist.
Yes.
Way back in the day. And I just realized, I was like, yeah, this was the show. And, Louisiana Conference had, I was a conference musician for a while at our annual meeting, and most of the conference musicians were a bunch of jazz players from this church up in Shreveport. And one time we were just having to play between sessions, and the main guy who ran it was a baritone sax player. All right, y'all, Sissy Strut. And they counted off and started playing it. And luckily I knew it. But after people were like, hey, how did you get them to play your podcast music? I was like, well, it's the meters, y'all. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not
original to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been doing the whole, you've been inside of the, I call it the Productive Pastor ecosystem for a while. Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw this on you. What do you think's the difference between, back in the day and then for the last couple of years?
Yeah. I think, I'll say from my perspective, here's a concrete example. I'm a Muji notebook person now because of you. And back then I was just starving for I just need some tools. I just need some concrete things. Tell me who to read. Yeah. There's one.
Still have
tell me what tools to use or whatever. And I think I was listening. Yeah. When I was in seminary. And so I was on my own kind of productivity journey. I wasn't always the best student. And I think back then it was just I was just looking for recommendations of very granular, concrete things to do. I think now, especially with the season 1 workbook and stuff, it feels much more you can personalize Chad's,
My weird brain.
recommendations for you. Like you kind of go through this journey rather than just like, hey, this week it's about this sort of tool. It's about notebooks, or it's about how to write notes in your Bible or whatever. And now it's more like, okay, a deeper kind of philosophical thing, which I really appreciated the recent episodes there. You could listen and drop in and go through that first new kind of revived season and personalize your productivity system. And so I think that's kind of the biggest difference. And I've just gotten a lot out of, especially that most recent kind of first season workbook. So yeah.
Mike Neglia, who runs Expositors Collective, is a podcast, and this whole super cool thing. It's a lot of Calvary Chapel pastors. Me and Mike are friends, and he'll be like, Chad, I kind of missed the hacks, but I'm digging what it is now.
Yes. Yeah. It's cool. And they really pair well together. Like I've appreciated here recently where you've like reposted an old episode.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, it still all fits. It still all holds together. So
yeah, it is. It's wild because it was 10 years ago. So I was 32, 33 when that started. And I really feel like I need to go back and tell for certain, but right now there's as many new episodes as there were old episodes.
Yeah.
So, roughly 2 years, we've covered the same episode ground that took like 5 or 6 years because the show wasn't, it would go through spurts of regularity,
right?
But it wasn't nearly like the every week rhythm it is now. But, podcasting's changed a lot in 10 years too. So talk about your context, because I think that's one of the interesting things with your productivity and what that might look like.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of like copying people, and I feel like it's harder for me to copy these days because I'm in such a unique context than where I was before. So I'm in Houston, and I was an associate pastor at another Methodist church here in Houston, Memorial Drive, and had an opportunity to go to St. Luke's Methodist in Houston to start a new community. So the background is they had planted a community back in 2016, I believe, 2015, 2016, that then left to be its own church. And St. Luke's had built this building to kind of incubate this new community. And even with the difficulties of that other congregation kind of leaving, doing their own thing, St. Luke's is such a missionally focused church. They know who they are. They know what they're about, that they're like, let's do that again. Like the way we've kind of talked about it is they didn't want to have a bigger shadow. They wanted to have a bigger footprint. Like they knew who they are, big steeple, kind of traditional Methodist church. They're like, we're reaching people, but we want to reach not just more people, but more types of people. And so they were like, let's start a community again. So that's where I came in, and we're wanting to reach a demographic of people. Like I say selfishly sometimes, like people kind of like me, like move to a city, maybe like spiritually curious, maybe curious about Jesus, maybe are kind of people that have left the church, and how are we speaking directly to them? And so that's kind of how I aim my communication at Branches. So yeah, we're in a building on the same block as St. Luke's main campus here in Houston. And we say like a modern worship community that kind of more describes the worship style on a Sunday morning. But we also say like a discipleship community, that we're trying to get people to tap into the kind of spiritual life and the life of a disciple, to be in groups and to read the Bible and become a deeper, more profound person. And so that's kind of where we're at now. And so we're just a little over a year old. We started in September of 2022. I had started in January of 22. And so, yeah, we're just a little bit over a year old, and it's really, really fun. A good group of people. I think other part of the context is that we're not only reaching people who, like I described, are spiritually curious or curious about Jesus or kind of disaffected by the church, but we're also reaching people who are passionate about reaching those people. And so there's a lot of energy around like, hey, we can embrace the mistakes the church has made that's alienated people, and we can also do church in a way that reclaims some things of the past, kind of that ancient future thing, and also do some new, cool, different stuff. And so it's kind of an energizing thing for me. I love novelty. I love new stuff. And so it's kind of every week of like, what new cool thing are we going to try this week? And so that's kind of where Branches is at these days. So
yeah. And it seems like from the productivity angle, one of the things I found out in coaching with a lot of the folks I coach is, and I know not all of our listeners are United Methodists, but most of our listeners are in the mainline. I do know that. Yeah. Is that mainline pastors seem to have this like inordinate administrative responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Our shared friend where we initially met, that's a conversation I've had with her before. And, in your context, you're part of a larger church, and some of that administrative load is not necessarily sitting on you, but there's also a higher expectancy, probably. This may be a good way to kind of move into the Newport conversation. There's probably a higher expectancy for the type of things that do require deep work.
Yeah,
you're talking about
sure.
the discipleship angle, the teaching angle, and then the relational systems angle. So like, how many folks do y'all have inside of like the branches community right now?
On Sunday morning?
Yeah.
We're averaging around 150 a week.
Yeah. And so like, how many people would you say like might come into branches over the course of a month?
Unique people. Yeah, probably more in that like 300-ish range, maybe.
Yeah. And that's what I'm seeing in a lot of places is it's not uncommon at minimum for like, you add about 35% to your average attendance all the way up to, I've seen churches that have, 300% larger inside of that. And so, managing 300 people and especially managing 300 younger people requires just, there's still that administrative load, but it's the stuff that probably takes on, a lot of intentionality and a lot of, lately I've been calling it closed door time. So you really have to think about what these things look like and then also kind of to spread your grasp. So what was the first thing to drop you into the whole Cal Newport thing?
Yeah. It really was, my passion for and excitement about kind of new church development and new communities and also kind of church revitalization that I've been an associate pastor my entire ministry career, and my last appointment, and certainly now, it was a lot of that, like, okay, now go do ministry, like go do the work. And like, okay, well, it's not very concrete. It's not like I'm punching in and doing the spreadsheets and going home. It's like make the work and make the connections with people. And so I'm little kind of scatterbrained person. And so I was like, I need to systematize or at least kind of simplify or kind of rein in all the sorts of like ideas I have and all the sorts of things I could do to things that are really going to move the needle. And so for me, when Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, came to me at a time where I just desperately needed it. It came out in 2016, but I don't think I got it until when I first moved to Houston. It was 2018. I read it and was like, this is what I've been starving for. Think about, what is it, the Eisenhower matrix between urgent and important. I was just lost in trying to distinguish the difference between those things. Sometimes I was like, well, to me it's important, but it may not be important to others, or what's my urgent is somebody else's important, and trying to sift through that. And Cal Newport, I think we have similar sensibility, is that he was just like, we're overcomplicating it. It's not that complicated. Time block hours to sit and read, to sit and write, to create content, to try to understand the kind of big animal that you're dealing with. And that's kind of what I'm doing now, is like, I set aside a lot of time on Monday and a lot of time on Thursdays to kind of just get my arms around what's going on, and also kind of assessing, and so of course sermon writing. And we're in Lent right now. I did a daily podcast through the Gospel of Mark, and so like that took a lot of intentional kind of deep work. And so he came to me at a time where it was like, I could just spend the rest of my life jumping from fire to fire trying to put it out, or leaving my door open for any person and be like, hey, would you call this person? Would you go to this hospital? Would you do this thing? All of which, of course, is part of the work. But have been giving myself more and more permission from Cal Newport to say, this block of time is for this and this alone. And it's made a difference for me personally, for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think one of the questions that shows up in Productive Pastor community a lot, and then I hear it from others, is there's like this golden goose of the perfect week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's no such thing. I've done whole episodes on it before, but I feel like, Cal Newport probably gives the best, and it's inside of Deep Work, really, is where he goes into it. There's a new book he just has come out that neither one of us have read. We're bad podcast conversation partners on that. But, Deep Work really just gives this frame and structure for this idea of what it means to create a week for you. That works. Because I think especially the longer you are inside of the job, You might not need 20 hours anymore for sermon preparation.
Mhm.
But there might be some new kind of stage of competency developed that does require, 10 or 15 hours of deep work. We have to shift over into that. I also I think about Cal Newport is, most people don't realize is he's also a teacher at Georgetown.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is it computer science? Is that what he
Yeah.
does?
It is computer science.
Yeah. So something very complicated, very technical.
Yeah.
He publishes inside of the academy. He writes for a couple of different, like, larger publications. And then it seems like every, couple of 3 years, he's cranking out another book.
Yeah.
And then he has his podcast, which I love because all he does is answer questions on it. And it's a couple of hours long, I feel like. I mean, that's the guy juggles, at least 3 very, very different spectrums. So he has his academic teaching load, which, most people, that's a full-time job. I mean, that takes them, he's at a Ivy League school in a very complicated field, and he's still highly accomplished inside of his academic field. The content creation side, just for his, Cal Newport.com, the Calport Incorporated, whatever, kind of his business side of that. Because he also has the planner, doesn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the time block planner? Have you ever gotten one before?
I have one. I have not used it, but I physically own one.
Is it cool? I've never.
It is kind of cool. I mean, it's the kind of I've done every analog planner that there is. So I have a stack of full focus ones from Michael Hyatt, and then I purchased this one. It seems like it would work for me. It's one of those things, you've talked about this on the podcast before. You have to commit to it.
Yeah,
I'm kind of in the middle of another sort of system right now, but I'm enticed by it for sure.
Yeah. The whole analog planner thing is hot right now. I do not have one out. Now there's somebody else who's making one that has a very, very, very similar name. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah, yes, I've seen it.
Very similar name, very similar branding. We're not going to go into that. But I am working on something because as digital as I am, I'm realizing, especially like this week is one of them, because we're recording this during Holy Week, sometimes pen and paper really is just the best thing. So he has that product side of it, and then he has his book writing. How on earth does he keep up with that? And it also looks like he goes on sabbatical and he takes months off, and
he speaks. He goes on speaking tours and stuff. Yeah,
and so it's like, somebody else has figured. In ministry, I think sometimes we're hesitant to enter into to learn too much from somebody who's not inside of church work. But there's a handful of people, and I really do think it's inside the content creation world. And I know that there's a whole new thing that I've been, in for the last couple of years, like through the Ship 30 crew, and there's, the guys that run that, Dickie Cole, I can't think of his last name, and Nicholas Cole. And then there's Ali Abdul, who's like huge on YouTube. Like these young, and they're probably closer to your age than my age. I feel like there's still an unhealthy level of hustleism.
Yes.
It's there, but I think some of these folks like Cal Newport, who are middle aged and are showing, they now have decades of their system that's been helpful, and they have the provability, I guess, to also see, their life is healthy. They've got good family lives. They don't have a trail of wreckage behind them.
Right.
Like I laugh at a lot of these new productivity guys. They're all guys that are saying this, but they're like talking about developing an SOP to find a girlfriend. I'm like, bro, listen, you don't need to. Notion's not going to help you. It's like, okay, you might take a little bit too far here. But I think Cal Newport, somebody I think ministry leaders can actually learn from, because you look at all the things he manages. And then I think specifically the idea of deep work when it comes to sermon preparation and just theological thought. I can't find a better correlative.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's probably the thing that attracts me to him the most. And like, I'll, watch his YouTube videos and stuff, how we made this connection. And he doesn't ever talk about the hustle or doing more or like, filling up a calendar. It's about depth. And I love that the focus on depth. And, there's a part of me that's like, is this just an excuse for me to do less? But then I see the fruit of it to say like, oh, like really, and that's the goal of the spiritual life in my estimation, is we want to be deeper people. We don't want to, the goal is not to do more.
Yeah.
And so I've appreciated that about him as well, that he's more interested in the depth of your life and the depth of the things you produce than the amount of things you produce or
Yeah.
the impact of the things that you produce. So yeah.
And with that, he still seems to produce
Oh yeah.
so
A lot.
much.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
you can absolutely totally push back on me on this if you want to, but like I even struggle, in the last 3 or 4 years, I think you've seen some pastors and some spiritual leaders kind of push into the depth piece. Pete Scazzaro, John
Hmm.
Mark Comer, Rich Velotis, that crew. But I struggle because I feel like at least half of the time, if not more, when I find ministry leaders kind of pull into that crew, you actually do see there is a fruitfulness where I've noticed that the quality goes down.
Hmm.
And like I said, you can push back, and I'm sure somebody online is going to push back. But like I do see, like, hey, you're just like using a spiritual excuse for some laziness now.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And I realize there's moments in time. There's been moments in time where I've just like completely shut down. I mean,
Mhm.
I deleted the whole first season of the podcast because I was like, this is a deliberate shutdown.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky enough in my career where at least twice, if not three times, I've gotten to take extended time off. One of them was medical, but the other two were just in transition and change where it's important to unplug.
Right.
Because, when you come back from that unplugging, you typically have a lot clearer of a focus of what
Mhm.
actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just talking to another pastor friend the other day about how ministry, and there's probably other careers like this, but I only know mine, ministry is certainly a place where you could be on either end of the spectrum. And that is workaholic, or do nothing.
Yeah.
I know, and I'm sure you do too, know both people at way opposite ends of the spectrum in that area.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another attractive thing about Cal Newport to me is that the deep life allows you, it frees you up to do the menial task.
Yeah.
It allows you to do both and not hate both.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, I'm going to set aside the deep time to do my sermon, and then also I'm going to time block to, like, I hate email. I think email's the worst. I think it'll be thrown into the pit in the end. That I got to set aside the time just to like chunk through email really quick, and there's great tools out there for that, but it's not the fulfilling stuff. It's not, I don't get stoked about email the same way I get stoked about like reading a commentary on Mark so I can preach my sermon on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's, learning, and that's the episode that's coming out this week in the podcast. In some of the ways I'm talking about the times and the way I handle, I've called it small ball before. And sometimes just the crap you don't want to do, but you have to do.
Yeah.
Lately, I've been thinking, and I can't remember if it was Abraham Lincoln or what, it was a president that the quote is attributed to a lot, and I'm sure I'm 100%, I'm being very sarcastic, 100% true, it's actually them. But the idea of like you have 2 hours to chop down a tree, you spend an hour sharpening your axe.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I've realized, especially in the last few months, that sometimes I have to just blow an entire half of a day
Mhm.
to build things out for the next month.
Yeah.
And then it's okay to realize that, and I feel like one of the things that Cal Newport does is, and I've just finished his book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he talked about the way that he, prepped out his dissertation defense for his PhD. And he bought like a $50 lab notebook that he said was so expensive he could not imagine he was paying that much money for it. And he literally wrote down every single thing that he discovered that day.
Yeah.
Because he knew the first thing he was going to do the next morning when he woke up was go through and process out all of his like random meandering thoughts to filter through, okay, this needs to go forward, this needs to go forward. So he had a little bit of the bullet journal idea inside of that with Ryder Carroll. But, there's things in ministry that we don't realize if we don't take care of, it's going to significantly affect us.
For sure.
6 months. Like I convinced my tiny little rural church of 17 people to start doing online giving.
Yeah.
And the way I told them is like, you don't need it right now,
Uh-huh.
but it's not just the online giving piece, which the treasurer quickly realized. He's like, oh, we're leaving like 20%, 30% on the table because people only give when they show up.
Yeah.
But then also the amount of giving data it gives you, like, this church is not in a financial crunch. I mean, that church is actually financially doing extremely well, but they weren't always. And there'll be a time in the future where they're not. And I was like, wouldn't you love 5 to 7 years of giving data?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And when you get into when you get into a tough spot, you don't have the luxury to burn 2 or 3 months of collecting that information. You need to have it now, and so this is the time to do it. And I think that he manages to explain away the necessity of what seems insignificant really well. And what I loved about the So Good They Can't Ignore You book is what he talks about so many times. I feel like this really applies to pastors. In our day and age now, you're serving in a large conference that still has a lot of ministry flexibility. A lot of conferences aren't like that anymore.
No.
We know we've got a lot of shared friends that you're in Apple with, and some of them are getting a chance to do that, but some of them are thrust into what our buddy Austin calls the crippity crap.
Yeah.
Pastors have to be, there's a level of generalism that really exists inside of mainline ministry. But what I loved about Newport in that book was it wasn't so much about being good and doing a bunch and being this person that everybody looks to and sees as this rock star or whatever, but it's about people's ability to say, okay, I've learned this skill, and then I'm going to go learn this radically different skill, and then and I'm going to learn how to stack them together. And I think especially for people in ministry that are under 40, you get into ministry because you want to do big, huge, great things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he talked about the ability to clarify that big, huge, great thing in that book in a really, really, really good way. And then the last chapters where he pulls apart. And what's funny was he was writing this book as he was preparing to get hired by Georgetown.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you realize, like, oh my goodness, he's writing this kind of like a low level. I read it on my phone in lines and at Waffle Houses. Wrote this kind of lower level book. At the same time, he's trying to get a tenure track Ivy League teaching position. And the whole last section is him just sort of saying, so this is how I applied all these principles. I did this research while I was also worried about this.
Yeah.
And so I applied all of my research and did X, Y, and Z in order to see this goal. And you see the whole thing track out. And to me, it's just this fantastic case study of, it's okay to chase rabbits, but you gotta grab the rabbit and get it in your bag. But then once you have everything together, and so it's almost like very unproductive work at times. Yeah. Ends up leading to tremendous productive clarity. And I've got a lot of notes. I might even do a whole mini episode on that book and learning about what ministry leaders can learn from it. But it's just huge. So like, what do you appreciate about, Newport's podcast?
Yeah. Well, one thing it is him, but it's also what a lot of the people putting their podcasts on YouTube do now is the cutting it up into chapters. You can see the different sections with the titles. Yeah. And so if I see one of his, he has these really spicy titles sometimes, like, learn how to stop being lazy or whatever else. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to find that section. But the video format, he's a good notes guy, just like you, that he projects his good notes onto the,
and he's a Trello guy. He also does Trello.
So. Oh, he's a Trello guy.
He's a Trello guy too.
He's a remarkable guy too. So there's a lot to love about the tools he uses. So I think that, and I think also, again, like, he has this air of like, it's not that complicated. Let me break it down for you. And I think the other thing that attracts me to him that he brings up all the time, especially with he talks about the deep life stack, this foundational thing, is he's like, you go back and you revisit it over and over and over again. Yeah. And I think some of the people you mentioned, like Ali Abdal or like Tiago Forte or like these other kind of productivity people on YouTube, it's kind of like, use this tool and do it this way and stick to this. And then it kind of gave me some freedom and I think maybe you have been in this position too. Like I'm tool and app addicted. Like
Yeah.
I'll see what's that Francesco de
Oh,
Alessio
yeah, yeah,
guy,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
the new tool out all the time, and I'll download it and play with every single new app.
Yeah.
And it kind of like, it can get to be a mess, but at the same time, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's not working for me. Maybe I do need to revisit it. And I think that reiteration thing, I mean, for Christian spirituality too, I think we like discipleship pathway is what I was originally talking about Cal Newport with is we think like, okay, we do step one, do this, step two, do this, step three, do this, four, do this. Now you've arrived. And we kind of then people feel like they reached the last step and they did it. And they're like, now what? The Cal Newport kind of model with the deep life is like you're always going back and revisiting
Yeah.
each layer of the foundation. And I think that's such a helpful thing for me in ministry. I think it's a helpful thing for people in discipleship is like, look, it's not a stair step. It's not sequential. You're
Yeah.
going to circle back and circle back and circle back. And, in my own productivity journey, that's certainly been true is that like I'll pick a tool and I'll use it for a while. And whether the tool changes, like, there's the Evernote conversation now, like how it's changed. And so it's like, okay, it's time for me to move on and do something new. Or,
Yeah.
I work at a church where a lot of people use Teams and I don't particularly love Teams, but I had to revisit and kind of figure out how that's going to fit in. Or like
Yeah.
now you're using Pulpit AI and I'm kind of dipping my toes in it and trying to figure out how to implement that. So it's never, I don't feel scared to add something or subtract something. I think probably due in part to Cal Newport, kind of his giving me some freedom to be like, all right, let's go back and revisit it and see what's working and see what's not. And also it's to the end of producing something deep and that's worthwhile. So that frees me to do the other little things. Like I had a baby back in November. My wife had a baby. I was there. I'm a dad now. And so, my margin is much smaller. And so this has never been more important. Like if I have to let email fall by the wayside and I write a good sermon for Sunday, I'm going to choose that. And to be able to say like, I did the work and in this moment, I was a sermon writer, and this next moment I was cranking through email. Like I have to be way more serious about that now. And
Yeah.
I think his whole idea in deep work about context shifting really was a game changer for me. That like we have colleagues who kind of pride themselves on the context shifting. Like they're always taking bites out of their sermon in the moments they can fit it in, and I can't do it because you can hear it in my sermon that it's just me like throwing little sporadic bits that popped into my head throughout the week. But if I really set aside the time in one context in my space that I've created for sermon writing, it makes a difference. And so all that to say, he's kind of given me permission to do some things that I kind of already was doing in a messy way, but also to change the goal. The goal is not to do more. The goal is to do what I'm supposed to do, but better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to simplify.
Yeah.
So,
And what's funny is what you just kind of also outlined, going back to the very beginning of our conversation today. I feel like that's one of the big differences when I went to reboot the podcast.
Yeah.
Was to focus on that direction.
Yeah.
Is not, because, I started that off when I was 31. I was an associate pastor who was getting ready to go church plant. And it was cram. Yeah. And now realizing, because you talk back about the sporadic scattered sermon preparation. I remember a couple of years ago, I had a church member who would love this conversation. He's probably going to listen to it, but he was just a kind of a productivity tool nerd, and he came to me and he said, "Chad, the last sermon last week was okay. It could have used a few more days, but I felt like what you were just really going through is a chain of read wise notes."
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man, that's such a burn because it was so true.
Yeah. My boss, Tom, he had a mentor tell him one time, he said, you don't want to spend your ministry and like get to the end of it and say, all I did my whole ministry was get things out of my notebook into their notebook. And I keep thinking about that. Like, yeah, I don't want that to define my ministry. Like, oh, I had this interesting, cool thoughts from the Bible. Here, put them in your notebook. And that's really had an impact on me.
Yeah. And I think that's what I appreciate is, for being an incredibly intelligent person, Cal Newport can explain, you said it earlier, he can explain complex things so simply.
For sure.
That's something that I know, now in my mid 40s, because I can easily see when I'm working with people, like that's a growing edge for me. and have realized that like that's a place of deep work, to learn, hey, yeah, you might could, shoot from the hip with this presentation about this, part of congregational development, which is kind of the world I live in primarily now.
Yeah.
Or you can take the 5-10 hours over the course of the month leading up into it and make sure this is easy to understand, run it through enough to where you're not having what could be a golden nugget pop up in your head, but it pops up in your preparation.
Yeah.
Not in the moment. And like I've learned I need time it takes me a lot of time to simplify things. Like you can even listen on the podcast episodes. And if it sounds like things are a little bit too complex and it's too hard to understand, what it normally means is this is not a podcast episode I've been thinking about for a month and kind of coming back to and revising. No, this was a Tuesday idea that gets recorded on Wednesday and gets released on Thursday. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the pressure of the, reactive versus responsive, reactive versus proactive. Yeah. That, Cal does a better job than anybody else. So, Colin, what we probably need to do is we probably need to both say we're going to read Cal's newest book.
Yes.
And we might have to circle back, at least on a Zoom call, just the two of us, in a couple of months.
For sure.
Because I think that if you're in ministry and you're struggling with productivity, I really do feel like Cal Newport is a fantastic person to kind of do a deep dive on to begin understanding, the thoughtful, deep life that is a healthy necessity.
Yeah.
For the person in ministry.
Yeah. If I could recommend one thing to people listening to like get a taste of him and how it might apply to your ministry is his most recent episode about the deep life stack. He's done it before and he just did an update, the deep life stack 2.0.
Yeah.
And just those layers and iterating those in your spiritual life, but also in your ministry. Like my brain has just been buzzing thinking about that connection for the past week or so. And so I'd really, really recommend people to dive into that. It's really, really helpful and simple. Like you said, it's simple. It's not. You're not watching it like I have no idea what this guy's talking about. You're like, oh wow, like that makes a ton of sense. So.
Yeah. Well, Colin, thanks for coming on. Being willing to have a different podcast conversation,
sure.
just to nerd out. And so,
we can do this all day.
Yeah, well, appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for the invitation.
A little bit different, a little bit the same, just productive pastor stuff that's always out there. I love talking with Colin, really about Cal, but also the difference between, what the show has been like over the course of almost 10 years. And we officially do have more episodes out now in the second iteration than we did on the first iteration. That first iteration lives on people's hard drives. Every now and then I've got to reach out to somebody in the community if they have an episode that I don't even have in my archives anymore. But you never know, those things keep showing up time and time again. But seriously, if you've not checked out Cal Newport, I'm going to have a link to the books that he has about productivity that I think are really helpful. Just go to the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/Cal Newport to find the stuff for this episode, this just different, the 99.5 episode, what this looks like. But it's always a joy. It's a pleasure to steward this community. Love having conversations about healthy ministry through strategic productivity. And we'll be back the next episode with the 100th episode Q&A, all those beautiful, glorious things. And I will see you when that episode airs.